Sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker, sir, for allowing me to speak on this Rule 193 discussion with regard to the situation in Ukraine. A horrendous tragedy is unfolding in Ukraine since the 24th of February 2022. 40 days later, 4 million people have been displaced. Over 4,000 civilian casualties have taken place. Indeterminate number of armed personnel, both Ukrainian and Russians, have been killed in the conflict. The alleged killings in Bucha, a suburb of Kyiv, has once again brought home the horrendous reality that war is only exciting as long as you watch it on a television channel. The long peace of Europe has once again been shattered after the Balkan conflict of the 1990s and the 2001. This conflict in Ukraine, unlike the previous ones in Europe, will redefine the global world order just as World War I did, World War II did, the Cold War did, the end of the Cold War did, the war on terror did, in all its negative manifestations. A new Iron Curtain seems to be descending across the world. And unlike what Winston Churchill had said at Fulton Falls in Missouri, and with your permission, Mr. Speaker, sir, I will quote that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in many cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. But unlike the Iron Curtain, which had divided Europe between 1945 and 1989, this new Iron Curtain has the potential of actually dividing the world once again. And behind it, this Iron Curtain, Mr. Speaker, sir, may lie the great civilizations of Russia, China, and Iran, and their myriad allies, Myanmar, Pakistan, Syria, North Korea, to name a few. And the recent joint statement on the 4th of February 2022 between China and Russia, expounding international relations entering a new era and global sustainable development, may actually become the foundation of this unfortunate division which the world is witnessing today. We may be once again witnesses to a new history being created in the world. Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, sir, in this new great game, Ukraine is today what Belgium was to the British-French enmity in the early 19th century. Poland was to the German-Russian rivalry for over 2 centuries. What Afghanistan was to the battle to bring down communism, a battleground, and unfortunately, at best, a chess piece. Mr. Speaker, sir, who is responsible for the situation in Ukraine? Undoubtedly, the first coercive step was taken by Russia. But then, Russia has been a trusted friend of India, and it has been a long-standing ally. Russia has come to India's aid in probably our most difficult times. This House may recall in its earlier avatars that on the 10th of December 1971, the then President of the United States of America, Mr. Richard Nixon, and his Secretary of State, Mr. Henry Kissinger, had ordered the 74th Task Force of the US 7th Fleet, led by the USS Carrier Enterprise, into the Bay of Bengal. And this was to stave off the liberation of Bangladesh. India had invoked the Treaty of Peace and Friendship with the erstwhile Soviet Union, and the 10th Operative Battle Group Pacific Fleet under the command of Admiral Vladimir Krushlagov, if I pronounce the name correctly, had slipped anchor in Vladivostok, and they had made Godspeed for the Bay of Bengal. And they were successful in checkmating the joint American and British task force which had come into the Bay of Bengal, and that scripted India's finest hour, and also late Prime Minister Indira Gandhi's finest hour, when we liberated Bangladesh and made it an independent country. That's a history for which, or that's an act for which we owe a debt of gratitude, a debt of honor to the erstwhile Soviet Union and its successor state, Russia. But then, Mr. Speaker, sir, friends also have to be told, if they are wrong, that they possibly need to get their act together. And 40 days into this war, and Mr. External Affairs Minister was smiling, what I meant to say was that Russia may have been told privately, or would have to be told privately, because after 40 days of this conflict, Russian war aims appear to be ill-defined or at best muddled. Does Russia want to split Ukraine at the Dnieper River? Does it want a regime change? What does it mean by denazification of Ukraine? Does it want to create a land corridor between the Donbas region and Crimea? Or is it testing the Anglo-American part? For Ukraine joining NATO is at best a cat's paw. It's been on and off the table since the Bucharest summit in 2008. And America, exhausted after 2 decades of trying to reorder the frozen geography and power balance of the Middle East post the dismemberment of the Ottoman Empire, should have anticipated this after their ignominious withdrawal from Afghanistan. But does Russia alone bear responsibility for this conflict? Mr. Chairperson, sir, in my humble estimation, the Anglo-American alliance bears equal responsibility. On the 26th of December 1991, Mr. Chairperson, sir, when the erstwhile Soviet Union ceased to exist, or it was dissolved, Ukraine was the 3rd largest nuclear nation in the world. It had the 3rd largest nuclear arsenal in the world. In 1994, in terms of the Budapest Memorandum, which was midwifed by the United States and Great Britain, Ukraine was stripped of its nuclear arsenal in return for amorphous security guarantees that if its peace or sovereignty was ever transgressed upon or trifled with. But unfortunately, when the push came to the shove, these political commitments evaporated into thin air. We have a saying in Punjabi, Mr. Chairperson, sir, and it goes as such, ki Rab nede ke kusun. Is God closer or the punch? And unfortunately, Ukraine traded amorphous security guarantees for what was a substantive, tangible security guarantee it had in terms of its nuclear weapons and its nuclear arsenals. This is a cruel thing to say, Mr. Chairperson, sir, but unfortunately, in the times that we live in, I think it needs to be said. Ukraine also, unfortunately, it seems miscalculated. They should have been far more sensitive to Russian concerns and the eastward expansion of NATO, which Russia time and again characterized as a security threat to its own sovereignty and integrity as a nation. In 3 waves, first with United Germany retaining its membership of NATO, then in 1999 with the Czech Republic, Hungary and Poland joining NATO, in 2004 Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, 2009 Albania and Croatia, 2017 Montenegro, 2020 Macedonia. 14 countries have joined NATO since the breakup of the erstwhile Soviet Union, and they all lie in Eastern Europe. And therefore, going all the way back to the Munich Security Summit of 2007, when President Vladimir Putin had articulated Russia's concerns with regard to this eastward expansion of NATO, possibly Ukraine could have been a little more circumspect and a little more careful. I wouldn't say that Ukraine should have gone down the path that Finland went down in 1948, what is called the Finlandization of European foreign policy. But I hasten to add that Ukraine possibly needed to be far, far more careful and cognizant of the security concerns of its eastern neighbor. Under these circumstances, when the world seems to be in a flux, and even around India there seems to be turmoil, there is political unrest in Pakistan, there is economic unrest in Sri Lanka, what is it that India should really be doing? And there I would like to commend the government. I would like to commend the foreign minister. The government so far has been very cautious and circumspect. The government has been trying to tread a very thin line. It's been trying to walk on the narrow edge of the wedge, and it's not a very easy act to perform. But I'm afraid that this may just be the beginning. The push may not have come as yet, because if you go by some of the statements which the United States Deputy National Security Advisor, who has an Indian-sounding name, Mr. Dalip Singh, articulated while he was in Delhi, or the exchange which the foreign minister had with his British counterpart, I think the pressure is just, getting built up. And therefore, my concern is that Nehruvian autonomy, what we call non-alignment, that held India in good stead between 1946, going back to the first Asian Relations Conference, all the way up till 1989, when the Berlin Wall collapsed. That luxury may not be available to India. We may not really have the option of being able to sit atop this new Iron Curtain. And the reason why I say this is not because I'm making a value judgment on the current government. Unfortunately, the geopolitical situation as it has evolved, post the collapse of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, has also made India take positions going back 3 decades. The economic alignment in 1991 with the Washington Consensus, the 2003 next steps in strategic partnership, the 2008 Indo-US civil nuclear engagement, and then 2014 onwards, the various defense agreements with the United States, namely the Logistics Exchange Agreement, LEWA in 2016, the Communications and Interoperability Security Arrangement in 2018, the Basic Exchange and Cooperation Agreement in 2020, the re-energized Quad that we have become a part of now, I think to a very large extent has taken us far closer to the West than we would have been comfortable with in this current situation that not only we but the world finds itself. So therefore, under those circumstances, I would like to, I'll just take 2 more minutes, Mr. Chairperson, sir. I would like to recommend to the government that the strategic autonomy, the Nehruvian principles of non-alignment that held India in good stead between 1946 and 1989 or 1991 are principles that are worth going back to. I know our friends on that side of the House, they leave no stone unturned, and with every breath they try and criticize the first Prime Minister of India, Mr. Jawaharlal Nehru. But the fact remains that those principles which were enunciated then possibly have stood the test of time, and Ukraine and the crisis in Ukraine and the position which the government of India has taken possibly bears the most eloquent testimony to those principles which were articulated at the founding of our republic. I would just end by saying a few words about the evacuation. I would once again like to commend the government for extricating Indian students from an extremely difficult, precarious situation. The External Affairs Minister had at length explained in the other house, and I was watching it on television, as to how the operation was complex and fraught with difficulties. But may I hasten to add that India has had a long history of evacuations. We've done 23 major evacuation operations going all the way back to 1962-63. And may I mention some of them? 63-64, Burma, Southeast Asia, where we took out between 300,000 to 500,000 people. August to October 1990, Kuwait, where we took out 170,000 to 200,000 Indians. 2006, July, Lebanon, where we evacuated about 12,000 people under Operation Sakoon. Libya, February, March 2011, and I can go on and on, chapter and verse. But I regret to say, Mr. Chairperson, and I'm ending my intervention, I have never seen the kind of chest thumping, the kind of self-congratulatory ecstasy, if I may say, which was at display during the recent evacuations, making young students, children, chant slogans in favor of the government in aeroplanes by ministers of the government of India, I think was a self-defeating spectacle. I would like to commend the government that whatever efforts you had made, commendable efforts, unfortunately got undone by that spectacle, which was completely unnecessary. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairperson, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Manish ji. Next, Sri Brijendra Singh ji.